Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Primetime at the Bethel Library. And the Primetime programs are brought to you by the Friends of the Bethel Library and the Faculty Development team and other offices on campus. And we're very pleased that we see you here face to face, but when you're unable to come for a presentation that you're interested in, these are archived, recorded and archived, and you can find them on the Bethel Library webpage. Just look under BU Digital Library. And so next week, we have coming up on Thursday the 22nd, Yehuda Zar, I hope I'm saying the name right, a junior communication studies and theater major who will share her global perspectives of students' experience studying in Seoul, South Korea. But today we're going to welcome a presentation by Edgren Scholars. And the Edgren Scholar program is named in honor of John Alexis Edgren, a Bethel founder. And it was him who had a key educational principle that he articulated back in the 19th century that said the relation between teachers and pupil shall not be that of commander and subject, but one of true friendship and helpfulness. And so in this spirit, we provide some funding to collaborations of Bethel faculty members and students to work on special projects, research projects, usually during the summer, and then ask them to come and tell us about what they discovered after that's over. So this morning, Marianne Harris and Morgan Johnson are the Edgren team who are going to present to us what they found out about the award-winning TV ads that they analyzed to see what values are being expressed in those television ads. Let's welcome them.
Thank you, Carol. As she mentioned, Morgan and I have been working this summer on a project that we're pretty excited to share with you. But before we do that, just want to first thank the Edgren Committee for selecting us. I know these are pretty competitive, and we are grateful for the opportunity that it provided us. Additionally, we have a couple outside folks, even outside of Bethel, that we want to thank. Dr. Betsy Anderson of the University of Minnesota and Professor Lorene Mirgadishian out of Biola University served really as consultants to us as we conceptualized what we wanted to do and how we wanted to set this study up, so we publicly thank them. Additionally, want to thank Dr. Jeff Jacob as well. He helped us as much with the analysis, or at least thinking through some considerations as we analyzed our data. And finally, Justin Bonanno, who's not here today, but Justin is also a senior marketing and finance student who was really instrumental in getting us to done. Because you do projects like this, and sometimes it's that last piece that you just need to finish, and sometimes it's hard to keep that going. So just want to publicly thank him as well, and thank you all for coming. So this project really was born out of some of the experience that I've had. I've been in the advertising and marketing field for a long time. It's hard to imagine it could be 30 years but time does fly when you're having fun, right? So I've been in the field a long time, and you know, as I was in the field, I really observed firsthand a lot of changes that happened. One of the things I tell students in my advertising class is that when I started at this large ad agency, I was in the account management program, the training program. There were 8 of us in the program, and we would have various training sessions by leaders in the agency. And one of the sessions, this person came in with a box of products, and he basically set it up by telling us that a key part of our job as we related strategy ideas to creative teams was to really, really understand what I have up there, which is features and benefits, right? So he'd throw product at you, and you'd have to say an attribute, you'd throw it to the next person, and it was just this illustration of the importance of content and really specific details behind products and services. And that's great, and certainly in today's world we still do a lot of work in that respect. I mean, I'm not suggesting we don't, but I think one of the things that has happened since then, since that 30-year ago time frame, is that the industry's just gotten more cluttered. Ads are everywhere, messages are everywhere, and so we have to do a lot more. We have to wrap them in things that are going to make it interesting for the receivers, for those folks in our audience. So in 2001, I embarked on a PhD program at the University of Minnesota, and having this background, I was pretty interested in figuring out how I could study this subject, this really macro level subject, and it was tricky. I don't know if anyone in here has ever dabbled and read much in the world of marketing journals, but if you do, you're going to find that marketing scholars are really interested in experiments and this, what they call the positivistic tradition, so a very, an experimental method that will prove something, right? Well, it's tough to prove macro level ideas. So it took me a while to kind of get some legs under me and figure out what I wanted to do, but I eventually stumbled into the area of storytelling. And fast forward 6 years, that's the area that I actually published my dissertation around, and the title of it was really The Impact of Storytelling on Advertising Effectiveness. And I've continued to do some work in that area over the last 10 years, especially trying to understand the different roles that agencies have in defining stories. So that brings us to really the last year or so in the focus of this project that we worked on this summer. So I mentioned a couple of individuals, Dr. Anderson and Professor Magardishian. So I go to these Christian business faculty meetings quite frequently, once a year, probably for the last few years, and I realized I'm still interested in storytelling, but what does that really mean for people, right, for end users? And so one of the things I thought about was, back in the early 2000s, I was interested in how storytelling impacted advertising. And in the last few years, I've been more interested in how advertising impacts stories, and ultimately how those stories impact people and culture. And that sort of birthed this idea of let's do a project and let's kind of figure out where to get started. So the idea of our focus of the project was really around exploring those connections, truly between values and advertising, as values are a conduit to culture. And ultimately the goal was to better understand values, and particularly the values that advertisers convey as they try to persuade us about the benefits of their various brands and products. Literature review, there's a fair bit of literature in terms of cross-cultural comparison between different countries. But in general, as I mentioned, the Marketing Academy is much more interested in specifics than some of the macro level ideas. So there weren't as many offerings regarding this idea of the impact of advertising on values and cultures as we would have liked. But we found a few, and there are a few that kind of have grounded our thinking. The first one goes back to 1990, right? And I'll try not to be too boring here, because I know if you're not deep into the literature, this can kind of be like, oh dear, here we go, but I'll be brief. So back in 1990, there was a man named Richard Pillay, and this is still a study cited a ton, out of the University of British Columbia. And the title of his work was Advertising and Cultural Values, Reflections in the Distorted Mirror. And his view was that ads really do more than just reflect what people are thinking, but in fact ads direct. They have more of an influential role than just to be kind of a true mirror. That in fact, the mirror is distorted. And he had some research that supported that. We also have another piece that we looked at a fair bit that relates to brands. And of course, this is where this topic can get a little complicated, right? Because when we talk about the impact of marketing values, it's hard to do that without thinking about brands, and that can get us down a slightly different road. But Douglas Holt did a book, How Brands Become Icons, and he talks a lot as well about cultural values. He talks about how cultural values really are a lens to help brands and companies develop, especially the icon brands that we see today. There's a piece, though, done more recently that actually Karen DeVay helped us discover, which was the one entitled When Brands Reflect Our Ideal World, the Values and Brand Preferences of Consumers Who Support versus Reflect Society's Dominant Ideology. And that one was just published a couple years ago at Duke University. And what's neat about this one, it's still a content analysis, primarily looking at print ads, but they went to Schwartz, so we felt validated because we had been working with Schwartz a lot as well. He was just a kind of a famous guy in the world of values measurement. But additionally, what they did was they were trying to get a sense for, they did experiments again and tried to figure out whether or not the ideology from which you make many decisions, your personal ideology, how does that work and then impact how you think about an ad's ideology that you see portrayed. So that became kind of a key piece of background for us. Ultimately then, as we kind of sifted through all this, we have a couple key principles that were relevant to us. Number one, we decided we'd do a content analysis. Now again, we could spend a whole lot more time talking about some of the other interesting options that we discussed, but content analysis is a nice one because it gets us started. It's a project that's fairly containable and felt like something that someone who's an undergrad marketing student could kind of get their head around more easily. Additionally, we decided to go with Schwartz. We looked at a bunch of different value options, but decided to go with the Schwartz method and Schwartz's value survey because it's Again, it's a little more straightforward, and we'll get into that again in a minute. So overall, some of the research questions we were interested in is, number one, are there really dominant values in advertising, especially effective ads, and we'll kind of tell you what we mean by that in a minute, that are viewed by the masses? Do the values that show up really correspond to what we'd expect? And how does this match up with some of the other studies that we've reviewed? Again, I mentioned this idea of effective ads or award-winning ads, and what we looked to was a database. There's a group out there called the Effies, and it's kind of neat because if you know much about advertising, you may know that advertisers love awards, right? All sorts of kinds of awards. And a lot of them are really neat and super creative, but many of us will kind of go, well, or did they do anything though? You know, it may have been creative and neat. What's neat about the Effies is it's not just about pure creativity as judged by, you know, some of the elite in the creative field. It's about effectiveness too. So you have to show your campaign, and you have to show how well it was received, whether it becomes measures like memory, affect, purchase intention, and even sales and share, right? We also decided to look at TV, and you know, in hindsight, this is one of those where, you know, maybe if we did it again, we'd go for something simpler. But TV's tricky because, of course, there's so much going on. But part of the reason we decided to do TV is because we felt like if we're really interested in the ads that impact culture, TV ads, particularly ones that also end up on the internet, are having a bigger role than probably magazine ads would have today, even though from a student and scholar perspective, that other option might be simpler. But it did make our work a little more complex. But again, life is short, and we wanted to do the most with it, right, Mark? And we made it work. Again, I already mentioned we looked to Schwartz instead of some of the other options like Rodekeach and others. But look to this on the right. So essentially, this is lifted right from Schwartz's values survey. He has 10, if you count them up, there's 10 values there. What's interesting to me is he has 4 different quadrants from which these values lie. So on the bottom, you'd have self-enhancement, things like achievement and power, right? That would be one element of value. You move up to the right, you have conservation. So I want to protect the in-group, right? I'm security focused. I'm worried about tradition and conformity. I move on up. It's a little more outside of me, self-transcendence. Things like universalism, overarching causes, benevolence, helping others, and then up to the corner is openness to change, self-direction and stimulation. So these are the general areas, and hedonism, which kind of falls in between. So these are the general areas that the Schwartz study will help us measure. So what you're going to see is Morgan's going to kind of take you through the methodology, sort of how we brought this to life, and ultimately what she found.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that sample of ads we were looking at. As Dr. Harris mentioned, we used the North American Effie-winning television ads for our study. That effectiveness piece of it was something that was really important to us. So not only are these ads judged on their creative content, but 30% of that judgment, that score that they're given to make it into that database, is on their impact. So whether that's brand awareness or whether that's boosting sales. So these are ads that are really helping the companies. The database is also great because it's a great representation of the population of television ads. For example, we see a lot of food restaurant ads, a lot of insurance ads. Some of those big categories that we see on TV a lot are represented in similar numbers in this database. We also see a lot of the large corporations that we regularly see advertising on TV. The criteria within this large database, we looked at ads only spanning from 2010 to 2016, partially just so we were staying relevant. Also because the database before then was a little less organized and didn't have the same setup as 2010 onwards, so we just had more consistency using that sample. We only had to eliminate a few ads, like maybe 5 to 10, that fell outside of 15 seconds to a minute. Obviously, we see that very rarely. Those really long ads, if they're over a minute, they're going to be telling some kind of story. So we didn't want that to bias our data. So overall, we ended with a sample of 386 ads. So as our coders looked into their instructions, there were really just 2 things we were looking for. That values piece, which we've already stressed a lot already, and then advertising or message appeals. So the only one of these I'd really like to touch on is admiration. I think the other ones are pretty self-explanatory. Admiration wouldn't just be for the product, but kind of for the person, something that's inspiring you to associate with that. So the most common thing would be like a celebrity endorsement. Coders were asked to choose just one message appeal and exactly one. That ended up being quite easy for me and Justin. You know, they're always using some kind of appeal to sell their product, and usually it's pretty easy to pick out what the predominant one is. On the other hand, for values, we were only asked to record one value, and only if we saw it as being a very blatantly obvious perceived value. So I would say in almost every ad I watched, I could connect to my own values in some way, but I'll go on a little more about how specific we were being on that. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about these values first. A few more that I'd like to talk about in greater detail. We of course fleshed out these definitions so we knew we were working on the same understandings of what these values were. Power and achievement was something that was difficult for us to differentiate at first. So power is focused much more on taking control of others, much more focused on externally and how you're getting ahead of others. Whereas achievement is kind of more self-focused, how you're bettering yourself and setting goals. Universalism and benevolence can also be confusing. For the purpose of this study, universalism was dedicated only to those big social causes. So a couple of examples might be like ending wars or gay rights, some of those really big topics that we're seeing in the news. Benevolence was a little bit more of the how you can help your neighbor type thing, so acts of kindness. And then security actually ended up relating to those two in a lot of the ads we were seeing. Security can be the type of national security, imagery of soldiers and the flag and that kind of thing, but it also relates to your smallest in-group, so how you're keeping your family safe and secure. So kind of working from the biggest group in universalism down to kind of your smallest hub in security. So some limiting factors of this research, we really wanted to just stress the fact of overlap on these, so me and Justin seeing the same things. So as a result of that, we said the values had to be overt and encouraged by the ad. So in a lot of them, maybe there were values present. There was a character that was exemplifying a certain value, but we were only including that if it was really tied into what they were trying to sell along with their brand or their product. And we were only asked to record the value if we thought most people would easily be able to take that in as well. When we did a practice presentation over this summer, kind of just showing some of that intro level research we had done, we actually shared some of our videos with the crowd, and it was really fun to see everyone coming to consensus each time. So we got a good feeling of it's not just me and Justin that are seeing this, it's a large group that's able to draw away those same conclusions. So I have one of our videos that I'd like to play for you guys. This is a commercial for a bank.
H is for heart.
Oh, sorry.
H is for heart. It's a sense of caring. It's both passion and desire. And at Huntington, it's what drives us to do the best job possible for you, to care about what matters most to you, and do our best to find solutions that help. You see, we found that a little heart goes a long way.
I like to be part of a team you can count on. That's why I'm part of Huntington.
So in that ad, we were seeing a message appeal of love, a value of benevolence, so something maybe historically banks were much less focused on, more about convenience and profit, those kinds of things. So for our procedure, this is kind of the nitty-gritty of how we got that coding done. There were two coders, myself and Justin. We were asked to watch the ads only once or twice to make sure we're not reading too much into things. For our first set of coding, we took some ads individually, and it was a completely random sample outside of this FE database, so just random videos watching on YouTube to get an idea of what it felt like to code, what the timing was like. Then we moved into a sample of 40 from this sample that we took from the database. We coded them individually, and then we came back and looked at our intercoder reliability. I think at that point it was already around 60 or 70%, but we knew to kind of get some credibility in the academic world, we wanted to be at least 80%. So after coding those initial 40 in the sample, Justin and I sat down, watched those ads that we differentiated on, and kind of talked through what we were seeing differently, maybe how we were defining some of these values differently. We then recoded another 40 of our larger sample, and we were at 84.6 intercoder reliability. So this is the big results of our study. Overall, over half of the ads caused us coders to feel a strong perceived value. That's a 95% confidence interval, so within plus or minus 5 percentage points. And what was really important about this is we could really stick behind these and say, I mean, this ad is practically shoving this in our faces. And we liked that for this initial study because we felt that it was a message that we could relay strongly and easily to others. This is how our distributions netted out. For message appeal, fun was used overwhelmingly. And how can you blame them? Because I think it was the easiest one to incorporate. As far as values, we had a few more in the higher percentages. So benevolence came up most frequently, then achievement, security, and power. I think because of how stringently we define universalism, depending on how you would make that definition, you might have seen that one occur more often. And we did also code for like the antithesis of all these values. But anti-benevolence and anti-tradition were the only ones that turned up, and very rarely at that. So I'd like to break some of these values and message appeals down by industry because I think that provided some of the most interesting analysis. In the food and beverage industry, which was our biggest, it was about 1/5 of the overall ads we looked at. Values were really spread across the platform. So pretty much all 10 values showed up fairly consistently and not one much more than the other. Message appeal, however, they were using fun even more often than the overall sample. Alcohol, in my opinion, was the most interesting. There were actually a lot of values showing up very frequently, and some that are very different. So benevolence, hedonism, power, self-direction, and stimulation all showed up super often. And alcohol was really the only category where almost every single ad had a value. So I think it was something like 98% of alcohol ads shared a value with the, like told a story and shared a value with their listeners and their watchers. So that was really interesting to me because what that told us is the alcohol industry really relies strongly on using values to sell their product. And of course we have some ideas of why that might be. One of them could just be that there's so much competition in that space, they have trouble differentiating, but also because we probably do drink emotionally, and they know that. Message appeal was an interesting item too because there was a large part of the base that was fun, which we expected, and that was the same across all the industries. But really it was only made up of 3 message appeals, so it wasn't a smattering of other ones. If it wasn't fun, it was pretty much admiration or ego. So we saw a lot of celebrity endorsement. We saw a lot of playing up to, you should drink this because you'll be cool if you do. Hygiene and beauty was another big subcategory, so I wanted to touch on that. Hedonism and conformity occurred most often, which wasn't a big surprise. And we had a few big categories in message appeal too, with a lot of convenience, ego, and health emphasized. I think that convenience part has started showing up more frequently. It seems like all the beauty regimens, all the health options for you seem to get more and more complicated. So now brands are trying to revert to, look how simple this can be for your life. And I just had a few other observations that I wanted to throw up here as well. Insurance was really the only one that got away with using fear and security, and most insurance ads use that combo. The truth is, we as consumers now are pretty aware of when they're trying to scare us about something, and we respond pretty negatively to that. But we understand in the insurance industry, that's why we buy insurance, because we're afraid of what could happen. In the retail industry, there were kind of 2 main combinations that we saw. So one of them was like convenience or profit with achievement. So they were saying this product or this service, it's going to help save you time and money, which will help you achieve more, was really what they were trying to tell their viewers. The other combination was fun and benevolence. So that's more like, we're a fun brand, we're fun, we help others, and that's kind of our shtick. I also wanted to make a note about vehicle ads. That's another huge category, which we can all attest to, we see frequently online. And I was really surprised to find that really the only values showing up frequently were achievement and power. And there were a few different message appeals that went along with that. I do think that might be different in a different sample. Our sample happened to really lean towards truck ads and sports car ads, which is not necessarily what we're seeing on television every day. So when you think of a company like Subaru, I think we could agree in a lot of their ads, they're really trying to sell security in their vehicles. That really wasn't something that ended up in our database for whatever reason. Those advertisements aren't effective, or at least aren't being recognized by the FEs at this point.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. So as you can see, a lot of great work. Morgan and Justin did a lot of great work over the summer, and from my standpoint, there was as much in what they found as much as some of the things that were left on the, as we like to say, left on the cutting room floor, right? Like, she kind of underplayed, but the amount of work she did, and that she and Justin, we had another coder who kind of came in and out as well, did in terms of just determining which groups we wanted to focus on. There were several iterations, right? So it gives me such incredible confidence, and that movement between the 60% and the 80%. It takes a lot of time to get those 20 points. It sounds like, okay, no big deal, but it really took some real effort. So from my standpoint, as I reflect on it, and Morgan and I have had many conversations, but as I reflect on, what did we learn big picture? I think one thing we're seeing is we do believe there's overt values in TV ads, and as she mentioned, our benchmark was pretty high, right? I mean, we were not, the value had to really be in your face in order to be coded that way. So we are seeing them. And it's interesting because for me, I was looking at I was going back big picture to the overarching shorts values in making some of the comparisons. But in fact, we did see power as one. That keeps coming up whenever you look at the literature. Power certainly is still one that Americans seem to care about. But this idea, this rub between universalism and benevolence, we see interesting, and one we potentially would look at further in the future. Because again, typically the way these studies have worked in the past is that Americans see power, achievement, and universalism, those as being critical, usually other Western European countries do as well. But in the Western European countries, universalism often trumps the power achievement piece. And in our country, it's typically the opposite. So I think what's kind of interesting about what we saw is that benevolence, again, it's not directly universalism, but this idea of helping others seems to be a bigger deal and more prevalent in these kinds of ads than we've seen them in the past. The other thing we wondered though about was, our definition of benevolence centered a little more around the in-group. We also saw a little more happening with security. So it starts to point us towards this idea of maybe a little bit of more conservatism, at least over the course of these 6 years. It's a thought, a hypothesis. Really wondering whether or not this idea of protecting the in-group, if in fact advertisers have advanced that idea a little bit more than maybe they even acknowledge. What do we do next? Lots of possibilities, right? I think overall implications, we really do see overt values present as mentioned. And again, from our standpoint, we see them doing two things. They can both protect the established view, and we see them also kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. And again, we think certain categories are dominating values more, as Morgan already alluded to. But in terms of potential other studies, these are the things that I've been giving a lot of thought to lately. Certainly we could go back and take a look at those, the 48% that didn't make the final cut, right? The almost 200 ads, and we've thought about that. But Morgan has mentioned, it's not as if getting agreement on those would seem to be a very easy objective, right? Because again, these are subtle elements. But it's still something that we're probably going to revisit and consider because it's a lot of ads, and we've done a lot of the hard work of sort of pre-testing and figuring out the system to begin with. The second one I have in bold, because this is one that I've just been intrigued by for quite some time. So, one of the things you think about when you, or at least I think about when I consider how values show up in ads, is I think about the people that are developing those ads to begin with, right? And a lot of them are grads. A lot of them are young people. If you walk the halls of marketing communication firms, you're going to find a lot of millennials, a lot of 20-somethings. It was like that in my day, and it's still like that now, right? And so these are the folks that are having a pretty big influence on what those messages are going to be. So from my standpoint, I think it could be, oops, I keep hitting my mic, sorry. I think it could be pretty fun and interesting to sort of play around a little bit with some of those creative teams, understand how they see their values being impacted between when they walk in the door or even just in their daily life, and how that happens as they're brainstorming ideas in the context of that development. So again, that's one that we've thought about. I also think about that one a lot because, as you may or may not know, I mean, Minneapolis is just a hotbed for these kinds of firms, and they're pretty accessible to us. I mean, again, at this point, we have a lot of grads in many of these organizations, so I think we would have some access, and that could be fun too. The third one we certainly aren't discounting is to think about experiments, though. It kind of seems like a natural to go out. Again, what we've done is we've spent our energy on on the industry out, right? But what about really just trying to better understand individuals as they're viewing these ads, and what are they perceiving and receiving as it relates to their own value judgments after they've seen those messages? Again, it can be tricky because we have lots of literature that says most of us think we are not impacted by ads, and in fact we are more than we think we are. So that is something one would think through, but certainly certainly I think there's plenty of literature that talks about various ways to get experimental evidence and even to set the experiment up so that we could do that with some confidence. So that's kind of where we're at. Would love to ask you for your comments and any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Jean.
Yes, Erlene.
When companies hire ad agencies to put these things together, do they usually tell the agencies we want these certain values portrayed, or do they just sort of turn the ad agency loose?
Good. Very good question. Yeah, good question and fair point. Certainly they have their values that they are advancing as well, no question about it. But I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a shift between what they're telling agencies and then ultimately what the agencies will develop as it relates to the message. Because again, the agency's job is to take that and turn it into something that's interesting, right? That people will remember and people will think more highly of in terms of that particular brand. But it's a fair question. It's not just the agency's job to really determine all that. It's kind of a give and take. And that's, again, I think what's sort of interesting about the field is what a collaborative effort it truly is between teams. Any other? Yeah, Jeff.
I just had a question of whether or not, in a content analysis kind of way, you did anything to examine the visual presentation of the ad rather than just the words.
I'll let you start with that, and then I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, so it was definitely something we were thinking about. In our initial coding scheme, instead of those two categories, were something like 15. There was like so much we could have looked at and so much that was interesting to us. Unfortunately, just the time limit and the restriction for what we were able to do this summer was a lot more limited. So we did think about some of those visual cues, and it was helpful to think about imagery in terms of those values. So I think I mentioned earlier with security, imagery of the soldier or the flag kind of beckons that security value. And there were some other kind of key drivers for that we were looking for.
That's a fair point. It's interesting you asked that because, as Mark had mentioned, we had this elaborate coding scheme. But one of the things we were thinking about, not even just with visuals, but what about format, right? So we talked in here about appeal, but another thing that's pretty relevant to the world of advertising is format. So for example, what about music? What kind of contribution might music have to the end user's view of your value? What if we got dug a little bit deeper into the technique of humor, right? Then you're bringing up a point around visuals that's actually been studied quite a bit, where a lot of folks in the creative field have studied this idea of, really like a closed-ended visual versus an open-ended visual, something more abstract versus something less abstract, right? How much, and in that respect, it could fit really well to study 3, right? Our next steps, because it's like, well, if in fact I don't give you much in terms of actual words to kind of close the loop, then theoretically you're going to put more of your own values and your own views into that, right? And so there really has been some interesting research done on that. So it's a very good question and something would love to kind of consider in a next step study. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up to that, I was just thinking different categories of products would probably offer themselves to different types of values as well, in terms of how they're portrayed. Technical products, you'll have close-ups, technical specs, it's about detail, whereas other things you pull away, you have a glamour shot, it's about selling the romance of the overall value rather than the benefits from the features. The other thought I had was just the differences possibly between TV and print, and when you notice one of the conclusions about the in-group kind of thing, we did notice post 9/11 in the print world, Made in the USA was just every opportunity. People that had it were using it. So I did see a big swing in that about that time for the first several years.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really stopped to pay attention to it since.
Good. Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Well, I'm interested in your comment that we don't think advertising influences us, but the research says it does. Why don't we think advertising influences us?
It's an interesting psychological observation, isn't it? Right? Because I think, again, I don't know if there's anyone in the room that has more psychology in their background than I do, but my interpretation every time I read that is that most of us feel as though, you know what, I am smart enough. Like I recognize that's an ad, and I don't just do exactly what they say. You know what I mean? Most of us feel as though we are tougher critics, or we are more intentional about how we think through what we spend our money on, what we buy, what we do, etc. But in fact, consistently, so much of the research says, again, it's not like it's like spoon to mouth that we're immediately running off and doing what these advertisers tell us, but it does impact us over time. I mean, good grief, look at even kids. You can see what, if you go to schools and you see what kids are wearing, it's like, I doubt their parents just came home and gave it to them. A lot of it is what they're being influenced by through brands, etc. So yeah, I guess, I don't know if that's an in-depth enough answer to your question, Leo, but it is something you read and see over and over again, and I just think it's like the human element of, there's a study, and Jeff Stitt could probably comment on this one as well. There's this interesting study that Ian Kolovich would do, and that this is another firm out there that looks at people's values and opinions. And it's like 80% of the people always think they're smarter than the person next to them. It's just kind of the human condition, right? We all feel as though we are a little bit more astute, and they find that year after year after year. So I don't know. I put it in that same category. Yeah, some of us has 98%. Is that what you're or 100? Any other questions or comments? Again, I just want to say kudos to Morgan. She is like unflappable. We stopped and started, and of course, in my typical way, if you know me, I had 15 on that spreadsheet, but at one point I had 20. So in my mind, 15 seemed really reasonable. And of course, 15 was completely not reasonable, right? And then you talk to other academics, and they're like, oh yeah, those are a good 15. That's doable. And within a short period of time, you realize how undoable that really was. So Morgan, I just want to say hats off to you. I think we need to give I think the other thing I would just underscore to that is, my hope truly is that we can take some of this and help some of the other marketing students who, in our department, we tend to focus much of our time on practical careers, which is fantastic. And not that higher ed and academia isn't a practical career, but it's a different kind of career, right? And that's typical for undergraduate business departments. But it inspires me to say, my hope is that we can bring some of this into classrooms to say, hey, this is stuff you really can study. And for me, that's how I got my first job out of undergrad, is I worked for a faculty member at a university, and I helped her, at the time I coded print ads. Again, I looked to Jeff because he and I have been in this industry a long time. I helped code Burke print research, and ultimately it was something to tell, it got me on the agency side. It was a story I could tell to people that I had credibility, but it also sparked this interest in me, I think. Like I mentioned to you guys how I would always be sitting in the room observing, going, okay, what are we doing overall? And I think it's because of that work that happened back in my undergrad education. So I hope the same is true for you. Thank you, Morgan. And thank you all for coming.